Bob Newhart died on July 18th, 2024 in Los Angeles County, California, at the age of 94, closing the final chapter on a comedy career that redefined what it meant to be funny in America. With The Bob Newhart Show, Newhart, and his Grammy-winning comedy albums, he proved that subtlety could be seismic. Off-screen, though, his greatest role may have been as a husband and father. Married to Ginny Newhart for over 6 decades until her passing in 2023, he built a family life that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of Hollywood. Together, they raised 4 children. What happened to the kids raised by a legend who never shouted, never strayed, and never stopped making people laugh? Below is the story of those children. Born in 19, Courtney Newhart was the youngest, the unexpected encore in a house already full of laughter. By the time she arrived, her father was no longer just a rising star. He was a TV institution. The Bob Newhart Show had wrapped, Newhart was already in development, and Bob's voice could be heard in millions of homes each week. But for Courtney, that iconic calm tone wasn't just a character, it was bedtime stories, homework help, and Sunday breakfast. She grew up in the echo of applause she never asked for, often introduced not by her name but as Bob's youngest. There's home video footage of a 5-year-old Courtney waddling through the living room in a dinosaur costume, reenacting one of her father's stand-up routines, too young to understand the timing, but old enough to crave the laughter. She was her dad's favorite audience, but also the one he feared might follow too closely in his footsteps. At age 9, she appeared in a 1986 episode of Newhart, her only acting credit, a blink and you miss it moment her mother called sweet, but enough. Bob gifted her a notebook the next Christmas, embossed in gold, in case you want to try. She kept it, unopened, for over 20 years. As a teenager, Courtney was bright, sarcastic, and protective of her father. While her older siblings resisted the spotlight, she seemed comfortable beside it, never in it. In a rare joint interview in 2012, she sat next to Bob as he reflected on his career, nodding with quiet affection, but offering no personal details. When asked if she ever considered comedy, her answer was disarming. I've seen what it takes. I've seen what it costs. I think I'm funnier when nobody's watching. She pursued education and nonprofit arts administration instead, working in underfunded schools and directing community theater programs for children who didn't grow up with Hollywood zip codes. She once said in a podcast interview, "Just because your house was full of laughter doesn't mean it was easy to be heard." Then came 2023. Her mother, Ginny Newhart, Bob's wife of over 60 years, passed away after a long illness. Courtney was the only child to speak at the funeral. Her eulogy was quiet, nearly whispered. "My mom never stood on a stage, but every story my dad ever told started with her." There's a photo from that day. Courtney standing behind her father, arms wrapped around him as he breaks down in tears. It became the last public image of Bob before his own death a year later. After the funeral, Courtney stepped away from her public life. She declined all interviews following Bob's passing, shutting down her nonprofit's website and removing her LinkedIn profile. Friends say she's still in California, working privately with underserved youth. Today, she remains the most elusive of the 4 Newhart children, a woman who inherited the family's sharp wit and total allergy to fame. She never exploited the Newhart name, never tried to remake his success in her image. She just quietly redirected the light he left behind. She didn't inherit the spotlight. She redirected it. Bob Newhart's 3rd child, born in 1971, Jennifer Newhart, arrived at the quiet midpoint of Bob's meteoric career, after the whirlwind of Grammy wins. But before Newhart brought him roaring back into sitcom legend, she was the only daughter in a house of boys, the one child who never seemed to laugh just because everyone else did. From a young age, Jennifer was observant, articulate, and, as her mother once said, a little too sharp for her own good. While Bob was filming during the day and writing at night, Jennifer was in the kitchen asking Ginny, "Why do people clap when Daddy finishes talking?" Her mother's reply, "Because he knows when to stop." Years later, Jennifer would say that was the moment she decided she didn't want to marry applause. As a teenager, Jennifer avoided studio visits and cast parties. While Timothy toyed with scripts and Robert mimicked their father's cadence for laughs, Jennifer was in her room filling journals with essays, poems, and arguments. On her 12th birthday, Bob left her a handwritten card with a single line, "Jenny, you're the line I never dared to write." It was his way of telling her he saw her, not as a performer, but as a writer. She kept that card in a drawer next to rejection letters from literary magazines she submitted to under pseudonyms. In the early 90s, she quietly entered the publishing world, working as an editor for a New York firm. She used her mother's maiden name professionally and refused all industry invites that mentioned Bob Newhart. But the question of legacy followed her, whether she liked it or not. When a major publisher approached her in 2005 to co-write Bob's authorized biography, she declined without hesitation. Her response, "I don't know Bob Newhart. I know my dad." She wasn't being cruel. She was being honest. The man who tucked her in and made her hot chocolate wasn't the man America laughed with, and she wanted no part of merging the two. She married in 1994 and had 4 children and moved upstate, far from the industry, but never too far from its orbit. Her writing, published anonymously in essays and op-eds, often touched on the psychological weight of being born into a family brand. Her turning point came in 2020 when one of her closest friends, a fellow editor, died suddenly of cancer. Jennifer left her position and retreated to a small home in the mountains. Since then, she's rarely been seen in public. But those close to her say she's working on something. Not a memoir, but a book about silence, legacy, and the distance between who we are and who we're told to be. She's never confirmed it, and maybe she never will. Jennifer never needed applause. She needed distance. And in that space, she finally found her own voice. She was the only one who rewrote the family script. Bob Newhart's second child, born in 1967. Timothy Newhart was born into the golden years, 1967, just as Bob's name was becoming permanent on marquees and network contracts. As the second child, he came into a house already shaped by quiet discipline and controlled chaos. His father was taping shows at CBS, his mother running a household with military precision, and Timothy was already watching from the corners. Ginny once said of her middle son, he had a stare like he was editing the room. Unlike his older brother Robert, who was obedient and measured, Timothy was curious, confrontational, and sharper with silence than speech. From an early age, he was drawn not to the performance, but to what made it tick. The camera angles, the timing, the scripts. He didn't want to be Bob. He wanted to know how Bob was built. There's an old family photo from the Newhart set in 1984. Timothy, then 17, seated behind a lighting monitor, headphones on, looking more like a young director than a teenager. That same year, he scribbled in a notebook, "Everyone laughs at Dad. No one asks who set the mic." At 19, he officially joined the production crew of Newhart as a gopher, quickly moving up to assistant producer. He also worked on other comedy shows like Ferris Bueller and Get a Life. Quietly, Timothy built a small resume behind the camera, always in the credits, never in the spotlight. Bob occasionally offered him writing opportunities, but Timothy refused. He once told a friend, "My dad has a voice America loves. I'm still trying to hear my own." But there was tension, creative, emotional, generational. In 1999, after Newhart ended and Bob began fielding offers for memoirs and retrospectives, father and son clashed. Timothy wanted to launch his own project, a documentary about the non-famous children of fame. Bob declined to participate. The disagreement escalated, turning personal, and Timothy walked away. He left the industry altogether, moved to a small apartment in Los Feliz, and spent 2 years off the grid. Only one thing arrived at the Newhart house during that time, a postcard with the words, "Don't build me a stage, no return address." Eventually, Timothy reemerged not as a showrunner, but as a high school teacher. He earned a master's degree in education and began teaching social studies and history at Harvard Westlake School in Los Angeles. He married Eve Makoff, a doctor, and had 3 children. In class, he never mentioned who his father was unless asked directly. To his students, he was Mr. Newhart, the teacher who made World War II more dramatic than most war movies. He traded the applause for a whiteboard and never looked back. In the final years of Bob's life, Timothy reportedly reconnected with him, not through work, but through quiet visits and Sunday meals. They rarely spoke about comedy. They talked about education, raising teenagers, and the weirdness of aging in private when your father aged in public. Timothy chose a path no one expected and no one applauded. And maybe that was the point. He found his voice by refusing to borrow his father's. Bob Newhart's eldest child, born November 1963, Robert Newhart Jr. was born just as his father was becoming a household name. In November 1963, while America mourned the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Bob Newhart was quietly redefining American comedy with his Grammy-winning debut album and a fast-growing presence on television. His oldest son entered the world not in the glare of a hospital camera flash, but in the long shadow of a father who would soon be called the master of deadpan. Bob was 34 mid-career and rarely home. Robert's earliest years were spent in a Los Angeles home where the phone never stopped ringing, and his father's voice often came from a TV across the room rather than from the next chair. As a child, Robert was unusually calm, well-behaved, what Ginny called a little old man in a boy's body. While other kids scribbled jokes or built cardboard sets, Robert was organizing drawers and asking when his father would be home for dinner. The family house was filled with laughter, but his childhood was defined more by patterns than punchlines. There were airport pickups, studio tours, and summer breaks in rented homes near wherever Bob was filming. Robert became the quiet satellite around which the Newhart family orbited. Never disruptive, never dramatic, but always just outside the center of attention. There's a photo from 1971. Robert, 8 years old, seated on the lap of his father between takes on the Bob Newhart show. Bob is smiling. Robert isn't. Even then, he seemed to understand the distance between Dad and Bob Newhart. That awareness only grew with age. He never acted, never performed, and never once expressed interest in joining the business. While his brother Timothy would sneak onto sets and Jennifer would challenge the family narrative in her journals, Robert retreated into predictability. He studied business in college, avoided celebrity circles, and kept a strict, low profile. In '93, Robert did one thing that tied him visibly to his father. He portrayed a younger version of Bob in the film Heart and Souls. It was a one-time favor. He never returned to acting, never gave interviews, and quietly stepped back into civilian life. The turning point came in 2009 when he was caught up in a business dispute tied to a failed investment venture. Court records listed him under a different last name, a subtle clue that he'd been distancing himself from Newhart in more ways than one. He settled out of court, left the corporate world, and disappeared from public view. To this day, Robert remains the most private of all 4 children. No social media, no business listings, no comment on the Newhart legacy. Some say he moved to Arizona. Others say he works in nonprofit financial advising. What's clear is that he made peace with being born first into a life he never asked to lead. He never ran from the spotlight. He just chose never to walk into it. He was his father's opposite, and that was the point. But Bob Newhart's story stands quietly apart. A whisper in a world of celebrity noise. A legacy built not on scandal or spectacle, but on restraint. In this world where most legacies scream, the Newharts were a family of echoes, and each child chose how loudly they wanted to be heard. In the episodes ahead, we'll continue down these quieter hallways, where Hollywood's cleanest names hide the deepest folds. Stay close. The next story is already taking shape behind another familiar face. If you don't want to miss what comes next, subscribe to Legacy Uncovered and join us as we reveal more untold lives behind the legends. Thank you for listening.